Good morning. My name is Rita J. King. I am live coming to you from Science House in Manhattan. Science House is a cathedral of the imagination, and we're located near Grand Central. We work with a lot of companies across industries, and our main business is called Model Meetings. It's our belief that when groups of people get together to work, the more clarity they have, the deeper they understand their purpose, the better off they are. My personal belief is in small teams and ultimately in pairs. I believe there's a huge amount of energy in pairs. So I have a real passion for pairs. So it's 2020 and I'm a futurist, and I always thought 2020 seemed like the year of the future. And I have a sign that I keep here in my office. I'll show you if you can see. You've arrived at the future. Hello. It always seemed like a far off year, 2020, but here we are. And it is eerie, I would say, to be delivering this virtual keynote that was scheduled months ago at a time when so many companies are trying to figure out how to work remotely. So I think since we're talking about the future of work, and here we are, it's really important to talk about remote work. I know in the last few days, we've had a very large spike in companies contacting us at Science House to try and figure out even the most basic remote work etiquette. So that's something we can talk about a little bit as we get started here. And it dovetails really nicely with the concept of pairs because, you know, we work with a lot of IT organizations at Science House, and they've started pairing. So people work together, share their screens, and it hasn't really spread much beyond IT though. And so, my particular interest is in how do we get pairing to start spreading so that it can start breaking down silos. And so one of the things I'm really interested in is the energy that comes when people pair with each other instead of trying to schedule very large meetings in small purpose-driven teams and pairs. And so remote work is actually a great opportunity to start doing that. So right off the bat, before we kind of dive in here today, I would say if you find yourself in a position to be working remotely right now, think about what it is that you're trying to accomplish and reach out to some people that you wouldn't normally work with and just have calls with them, like this one-on-one. I mean, of course, this is, I'm talking to you and I can't see all of you, although I wish I could. And if any of you have any comments after, feel free to contact me. But I think there's really some kind of magic in the video conferencing connection, just seeing someone and also setting up an environment where you can actually, concentrate and focus. And so one thing I would just say right out of the bat, future of work, here we are. Think about the pairs that you don't normally work with across functional areas and even across levels in a company. So I'll dive in a little bit and give you a little bit of background, just so you can have some context as we dig in. I was a journalist, an investigative journalist in the beginning of my career for quite a few years, and I specialize in systems. I really like complex problems and just thinking about systems as a whole. And when you think about the future of work, it's a lot of ecosystems. That's a word that you hear more and more frequently, and it's relatively new to large corporations. So I want to begin by just showing this to you. I'm not using slides today. Figure I would keep it a little more casual, but this is a book called Business Culture Design by a wonderful colleague and friend named Dr. Simon Sagmeister. And he wrote this book, and I wrote the introduction. And this book is based on a system that he created that visualizes the dynamics of culture. And it's quite interesting. I'm going to show you just a tiny little thumbnail here, but you can Google. So you can see that there are, 7 different colors that represent 7 different dynamics. And every team, really every individual, every enterprise has all 7 of these dynamics. And Some of them are on the energizing side, and some of them are on the stabilizing side. And Science House has licensed this tool from the Culture Institute, Dr. Sagmeister's organization that he founded. And we use it to help map clients' cultures before we begin. And I still remember when Dr. Sagmeister came to Science House, and it was incredible. He had these little 7 laminated hexagons way back when. We've been collaborating for years. And I was immediately fascinated by this idea that you could visualize culture. And you really can. And I just want to put that idea in your mind as we talk here today, because usually culture is considered this nebulous, sort of touchy-feely, soft skill. And it's not soft at all. And in fact, I would argue that all of the soft skills are actually the most difficult, but we put them off until the end to learn them. And the skill sets of the future really are those soft skills, and including, most importantly, clear, concise communication, particularly about complex issues. But the reason I bring up Culture Map and this book, Business Culture Design, is because almost every company that we've mapped at Science House has a very similar looking current state. We map that first, all 7 dynamics, and then the hexagons are different sizes depending on how much of that dynamic appears in the culture. And their future state cultures also look very, very similar, with the notable exception of Amazon. And we'll get to that in a second. In the current state, they have a lot of very stabilizing dynamics, which will probably not surprise a lot of you, consensus-driven, hierarchical, and they want to evolve into a more ecosystem approach, flexible, entrepreneurial approach, more data-driven, a little bit more fast action. But that's a very hard transition, and the trade-offs are considerable. And so one of the skill sets of the future of work is the ability to take all this ocean of data that's coming at all of us and make sense of how to visualize it. And this tool does that beautifully, but it also enables you to really see those trade-offs pretty clearly. And the hard work kicks in, and then this is what we do at Science House. The hard work kicks in when you're trying to move from the current state to the future state. And so I'm telling you here today that there are very clear themes and patterns in that journey. And I will show you this gigantic book called Science House. I mean, you can see how thick that is. These are the themes and patterns that we've uncovered in the companies that we work with across industries. So I'm not, pulling this out of thin air. I'm telling you what the data unequivocally shows. But let's start with Amazon. Some of you may remember a few years ago now, the New York Times wrote an article about Amazon's culture and how bruising it was to people is to people. And so what we did was we used this tool, Culture Map, to analyze the data in that article and to look at what makes Amazon different. Now we're talking about Amazon.com. AWS may have a different culture. This was focused on the culture as presented in that article. And one of the things that we found is that for Amazon, in that context, for example, this is one example of many, legal works for the business, if you will, right? So in a lot of companies, one of the patterns in this giant book I just showed you is that they're very risk averse. And I often joke around that I, with no legal training whatsoever, could perform the function of legal for most large companies if I just said no to everything anyone asked me to do. So there's a fundamental misunderstanding of risk and, the risk of doing nothing or moving too slowly in a world of extremely intense competition. Another thing that Amazon does is focus on their customers rather than their competition, and they really understand their customers. And I'm not here to defend Amazon. I'm just telling you the difference in most maps and then their map. And the reason I bring it up is because Amazon saw that piece and invited me out to do some keynotes. And what I'm telling you here today was from prior to that work. But they're interested in avoiding becoming more like a large company, whereas most large companies are interested in, they don't say becoming more like Amazon, of course, because there's trade-offs again, but some of what Amazon has. Getting speed to market, for example. You hear that with a lot of companies, but they're not doing the work that would get you to market more quickly, because there's a lot of hierarchy, consensus, a lot of hoops that you have to jump through. And so another skill of the future and a mindset that you need to embrace in order to get there is really clearing the clutter and focusing on the mission critical stuff. Because the stuff that used to get people, to the corner office, if you will, really no longer is, and a lot of that, it no longer is really applicable in the same way. And so we have to think differently, which brings us to the next, skill of the future, which is taking the time to think clearly. I call it, slowing down to speed up, because we're all bombarded by so much data constantly now that we really don't have a lot of time to think. And because we don't have time to think, we miss a lot of the patterns in the complexity around us. And one of the most valuable skills that anyone can have in any organization, and also on planet Earth in 2020, is the ability to think through a complex situation clearly and creatively, and then communicate concisely the right information to the right person at the right time. This skill is, far and away the most important. And what do I mean by creativity? Sometimes people think creativity is something that artists do. Our belief at Science House is that creativity is absolutely everywhere. And one of the things we are really big on is applying creativity to processes. So Science House is founded by James Jorash, who is an inventor, and he's named on over 750 patents. He's one of the inventors of Priceline and many other companies across industries. And very interesting thinking about creativity. It's the glue that binds at Science House. So creativity is another skill that is in hot demand, and anyone can continuously practice. And it does require continuous practice. And very often people will come to Science House and hold up their iPhone and say, well, we're never going to invent the iPhone. And we say, you don't have to. It's been invented for a long time. But what is your version of that? And instead of thinking so tremendously about something so huge and earth-shattering, what about thinking differently about the processes that govern your own team, your own organization? What are some of the stumbling blocks that are preventing you from achieving the speed that you talk about? And so that is a hugely important skill set of the future. And the mindset that you need in order to achieve that is just take a breath, and think about as many ways as you can to do something before you pick one and start aligning people around it. And that's one of the biggest sort of pillars of our model meetings framework. Is people typically try to align before they've done the steps prior to alignment. And that's why it often feels like herding cats, because you're trying to get everybody moving in the same direction, but it may not be the right direction. So taking the time to think is a really important skill, and an important mindset to embrace. Along with creativity, I'd like to take a couple minutes and talk about imagination. That is my life's work, is the development of imagination, another skill that sounds on the surface to be very soft, but is in fact, I would argue, done well, probably the most hardcore of all the soft skills, and maybe all the hard skills as well, because nothing is accomplished without a lot of imagination. So what do I mean by imagination? So when I left journalism and started working with companies, I started working with senior executives, advising them on the business value of the internet and technology. I specialize as a futurist in the unintended consequences of our technologies and our inventions coming back to haunt us. And I realize that also extends to our own human behaviors. But I saw patterns across industries that senior executives and companies were facing. And what I could boil it down to is that all of us were raised in industrial era mindsets, right? So conveyor belt mentality, bell rings, we go to the next, we go to the next class in school. The mitigating factor of the industrial era was how quickly could you move to assemble something, right? And we're ahead, and it's very easy for our brains to make sense of industrial era products, by the way. I may not know how to build an engine, but I know one when I see one. These products tend to be binary, physical, easy for our brains to make sense of. Of course, there was a lot of complexity in the design of the industrial era products, but typically they were created in a conveyor belt fashion and speed was a mitigating factor. Now, companies are trying to leap straight into the intelligence era, and the products of the intelligence era are much more difficult to parse out mentally. They're much more complex. Code, algorithms that are governing our lives in ways that we can't really see or understand. These are intelligence era products. And I'm not here to glamorize factory life, but when you were at work in that era, during the heyday of that era, you knew you were at work, right? And that's true for a lot of people still today. Knowledge workers, however, have phones on them and email, and they can just hop in and do work at any time. And so there's a much more fluid environment of you're not really ever sure when you're at work or when you're not at work. And it's simply enormously more complex in the intelligence era than it was in the industrial era. So what I found is that companies are attempting to leap straight out of the industrial era and just land right in the intelligence era as if there's no transition in between. And that's ludicrous. And you could see why people are in chaos and completely overwhelmed. And so I created a concept that I call the imagination age. And I've been developing it since about 2006. And in the imagination age, we use our imaginations to get from point A to point B. And I don't mean that we lay around and daydream in a hammock, although that sounds great right now, and I'm sure we probably all would love to. And that is a form of imagination. But my idea about imagination is more specific. It's about problem solving. So I think about it as a continuum. Over here, we have fantasizers, and fantasizers are people who don't have to worry about whether an idea is feasible. They don't have to worry about how you're going to pay for it, who's going to do it. It's fantasizers are fantasizers. They're on this end of the spectrum, on the extreme end. On the other extreme end of the spectrum, we have what I call followers. And those people just say, innovation, you go do it, and you just give me instructions, and I will listen to your instructions. And in the middle of those two extremes, we have what I call applied imagination. And applied imagination is really a slider, and it's how you think about whether or not you're solving the right problem. So, at Science House, we're huge believers in the scientific method. And when you apply the scientific method, you are on a journey of curiosity. And you want to be proven wrong, right? I mean, you don't ever want to be proven wrong, but you're open to the idea that you may be wrong about something. You don't just declare something and act like it's real. You're on a journey to uncover it. And imagination, to uncover a better way. And imagination is how our brains navigate this world. Ultimately, imagination, I would argue, is what makes us human, even though, people can argue about whether or not, machines and software will be replacing our imagination. This takes us to the most pressing topic of the future of work, which is our collaboration with our own creations. The hardware and software that we create requires a tremendous amount of imagination. In the imagination age, AI is applied imagination, not artificial intelligence. do not believe in artificial intelligence as a concept. I think we only believe it's artificial right now because it is outside of us and we can clearly see the line, we think, between ourselves as humans and the technologies we're creating. Increasingly, day by day, they are so woven into everything we do. I mean, you need look no further than how do you feel when your phone battery is dead, or when you're flying too close to the sun because you have 4% power left. You know how you feel because that is an extension of you. To call it artificial, people use that term constantly and ubiquitously to mean all sorts of things. I I think we need to take responsibility for the things that we create, and this is a major skill of the future. To embrace this, we need to think of our creations um, in terms of the value they capture for human societies. We have some really serious problems that we're trying to deal with, and this brings us to the next sort of pillar of my philosophy, which is there's a lot of ways to do anything, right? That's where the creativity comes in. There's always a lot of ways to do anything. Um, the people who choose the way that is balanced between, good for the company, good for society, those are the people we need more of in the world. And of course, as an individual, you always want to understand how your own contributions contribute to that outcome. And companies have an obligation to get much more clear on their purpose and their vision. But please, if you take anything away from this talk, let it be that there are many, many ways to do anything. The people who are in the hottest demand now and in the future are going to be the people who know how to collaborate, who are very good at accepting the ambiguity that we all have to deal with now, who can communicate complex information, think through and communicate complex information concisely, apply imagination and creativity in a flexible way. And you do not have to be a scientist to apply the scientific method. Well, you would be a scientist if you applied the scientific method. I mean, you don't have to be a chemist or a biologist or a physicist. The scientific method is something any of us can practice. And there's an art and a science to the future of work. To practice the scientific method, view yourself as a person on a journey and understand that the milestones of that journey that used to be much more clear cut are much more ambiguous now. And one thing I see a lot of, particularly with HR, is people want a lot of feedback about their performance, and they of course, and they want to know where they're headed in their career progression. That in and of itself is an act of communication, right? So I would argue that the person who is looking for help navigating their career has to collaborate with the people who have information that they need. Whereas in the past, it was more, there's a way to do it, and your mentor teaches you that way, and you just hit those milestones and you progress in your career. It doesn't work that way anymore because of the ambiguity and the way everything changes constantly. People who can keep a level head, take a breath, think, and build diverse teams that are inclusive. I cannot stress this enough. People tend to gravitate toward people who look and act like themselves, and that is an outdated philosophy as well. The future of work is global. It is an ecosystem, and this is where taking a breath and thinking comes in as well, because when you're working on truly diverse teams that are truly inclusive, you will be your own beliefs will be put to the test repeatedly, and that's a good thing. So the extent to which you can navigate the pressure of feeling like your own beliefs are being questioned, that's another thing that will make you very, very successful. So I'm out of time. I appreciate all of you being here. Thank you very much. I wish that we could have it be more interactive. So if any of you want to get in touch with me, Rita at sciencehouse.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn, Rita J. King. And I really appreciate you all being here. And I hope that the future of work is filled with imagination and creativity and the kind of problem solving skills we need to build a world that we want to inhabit. Thank you so much. Have a great day.